expert for today. His name is Professor John Reid, and he's joining us, like I mentioned earlier, from New Zealand. So he's a professor emeritus at the University of Auckland, and he's done a lot of courses and workshops covering language testing and assessment for over the past 40 years. So there's going to be a lot of good information and knowledge that he can pass on to all of you that hopefully can help you in your classroom and with your students. So going to go ahead and get started. So if you're ready, Professor Reid, I'd like to hand it off to you, and I will see everyone later. So looking forward to this great webinar. Okay, so Professor Reid, you can share your presentation and can get started.
Okay, thank you, Gary, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'd like to thank the folks at eFuture for inviting me to join this series of webinars with such a distinguished group of experts in ELT. So I hope that you'll find my presentation just as worthwhile as the other ones. So my topic today is language testing and assessment. And I know this is a topic that a lot of language teachers are not very confident about. You probably all give your students tests in the classroom and maybe prepare them for important external tests and exams, but maybe you haven't been introduced to the basic principles of testing and assessment as part of your teacher education. I know it's a common gap in teacher training programs to focus on testing and assessment. So I'll try to fill that gap, if it is a gap for you, in your understanding of what this topic is all about. Now, I believe that some months ago, a call went out for questions about this topic, and a number of you submitted questions. And so I've used those questions as the basis for choosing the topics that I'm going to talk about in the webinar today. So those are outlined on the screen. First of all, defining these terms, language testing and language assessment. Then talking about purposes of assessment. Why do we want to assess our students? What the different purposes are. And then features of good assessments, which are summed up in the concept of validity. But there are a number of aspects to that which I'll go over in the third part of my presentation. And then I'll also talk a little bit specifically about assessing speaking ability, because that was one of the questions that was submitted earlier for this webinar. Okay, now going on to my first topic, defining the terms. What are testing and assessment? And what's the difference between them. When I first got involved in this area about 40 years ago, as Gary mentioned in the introduction, we always used to talk about language testing. That was the name of this field of study, and it was very much to do with formal tests and examinations. So I guess you're all familiar with these kinds of scenes of young people, and maybe not so young people, sitting at individual desks in a large room, concentrating on responding to questions on a written examination paper. So that's basically what language testing was about back when I got started. So we're talking about assessment events, if you like, that have these kinds of characteristics, taken under strictly controlled conditions. There's a time limit. You have to complete the work within 1 hour or 2 hours or however long the exam is. There are people observing to make sure that no one's cheating. And often these tests operate on a national or international level. They're not just local tests for your own school. And they're important for various ways. We use this term high stakes. So there are important outcomes from the results of an exam or a test like this. And you'll notice I'm using the term test and exam somewhat interchangeably. You may use one term more than the other. When I first started, I used to make a distinction between tests and exams, but I think these days they more or less mean the same thing. Maybe in particular contexts, one term is preferred over the other, but whichever term you use, this is really what language testing is all about. Whereas language assessment is a term that's become more prominent in the last maybe 20, 25 years, starting in the 1990s. And it's a broader term which certainly includes formal tests and exams of the kind that I've just been talking about, but covers a range of other procedures, particularly those that teachers can use in the classroom for assessing their students. So if we look to have a definition of this broader concept of language assessment, this is the way that I would define it: a process of finding out what our students have learned or what their language ability is in a more general sense, in order to make decisions that are related to the purpose of the assessment. So this leads me on to my second topic, purposes. Why is it that we need to assess our students? And I like to look at it in terms of these three phases: initial assessment, formative or continuing assessment, and then summative or final assessment. And so let's look at each of these in turn. Initial assessment happens at the beginning of the school year, at the beginning of a course where you're working with a new group of students. If you're in a language school which draws students from different backgrounds, maybe different parts of the country or different schools, and maybe some of the students have had the opportunity to live in an English-speaking environment, live overseas, then it may be useful in a language school to have a placement test to determine quickly where each student belongs in your program, what class level they should go into. So that's a particular function of tests at the initial stage. But also, more generally, within your class, you may engage in initial assessments, even if students are coming from another class in the same school. In one of the earliest webinars in this series, Paul Nation talked about his picture vocabulary size test, and he discussed that as a tool that teachers can use when they're first working with a group of students to see roughly how many words they know and to plan vocabulary teaching and learning activities on the basis of those scores. It's quite common also to give older learners a writing task right at the beginning, just to see what their level of writing ability is. So that's the sort of thing that we can do at the initial phase of our teaching. But a lot of assessment takes place while the course is going on. So during the term, during the school year, where we're monitoring students' progress in their learning. And then the other side of that coin is diagnosing areas of difficulty. And so this is for the purpose of giving feedback both to students themselves and also to the teacher about things that they're doing well and others maybe that they need to work on harder, or in the teacher's case, maybe you need to design some additional activities or change your teaching approach if it turns out that some of the students or many of the students are struggling with the kind of program that you're delivering to them. And in summative assessment, I've called this final assessment, so it's often associated with an end of year or end of course exam, which is a more overall measure of the student's achievement based on all the work that they've covered in the syllabus or in the textbook during the course or during the term, the semester. But this kind of assessment doesn't necessarily occur right at the end of the period of study. It may be that you prepare your students for one of the international tests like TOEFL or the Cambridge exams or the Pearson ones, and they may be scheduled at different times during the year, but still have a summative function of looking more broadly, not just at what the students have been studying during the course, but in a more general sense, what they've achieved and what level of ability they have reached in English. And often this kind of assessment is not just for the teachers and the students, but parents often have a great interest in final grades. And there's this issue of accountability, where we need to report results maybe to the headquarters of our education organisation or to the Ministry of Education. So summative assessment has high stakes in that sense, and that important decisions are being made about the students on the basis of that kind of assessment. So looking at types of assessment from this broader perspective, in many contexts, particularly if you're dealing with large numbers of learners, even if you have large classes to teach within your school, maybe a test or an exam may be the most practical way to assess all of your students on a consistent basis. But particularly within the classroom context, there are a variety of other options which are often known as alternative forms of assessment. So monitoring student performance of regular classroom tasks is one possibility. Just teachers observing individual students and making notes during the course of the year in order to be able to identify those who are performing well and those who may need extra support. There's also maybe the possibility of individual conferencing, where the teacher meets with students individually and talks to them. Often this is done with older learners for writing assessment, where the teacher will review their writing and give individual feedback. For young learners, I know even for young native speakers in New Zealand primary schools, individual conferencing is used for developing literacy skills and monitoring children's development of reading and writing. Portfolios are now another popular form of assessment, where we assemble samples of the students' work, and maybe these are reviewed by the teacher at different points, and a portfolio can also be used for a kind of summative assessment as well. The two other types of assessment which are a little bit different, the ones I've talked about so far are ones that are all conducted by the teacher, but there's increasing emphasis these days on self-assessment, encouraging learners to assess for themselves what they're able to do in English and what causes difficulty for them. Also peer assessment, so for writing and speaking tasks, other students in the class can listen to one of their classmates talking and give them feedback on whether it was a good talk or not, whether there were any problems and how they could improve. And something similar can be done for writing, where students exchange drafts of a writing task or a project that they've been given and get feedback in that way. So that brings in a different element of shared responsibility for assessment. So it's not just the teacher making the judgments, but the students themselves are encouraged to participate in that process. Okay, so just to sum up what I've been saying up to this point, we can identify two assessment frameworks, if you like. So the traditional one, based on formal tests and exams, which are often used when a large number of students have to be assessed. And that kind of assessment is appropriate for these kinds of purposes that I've listed at the bottom of the left-hand column. But language assessment in the broader sense involves assessment predominantly in classrooms and in schools, and this offers the opportunity of a wider range of assessment tasks and procedures of the kind that I've just been discussing, and so those are more suited for these kinds of purposes for assessment. Right, so that's the first two topics that I plan to cover, defining what we mean by testing and assessment, and also relating that to different purposes of assessment. Going back to that general idea that we need to make decisions about learners, and some of these small decisions, day-to-day decisions to do with activities in the classroom, but particularly with summative assessment, these are more important, or what we often call in my field high stakes assessments, and those have to be taken more seriously. And there are other people, not just teachers and students, but also parents, family members, and school administrators, and maybe government officials who have an interest in the results of that kind of assessment. All right, now let's go on to my third topic, which is going to take somewhat longer to talk about, and these are the features of good assessments, and we can sum that up in the question, what makes an assessment valid? So validity these days is considered to be the primary feature, something that we should strive for in having a good quality assessment of our learners. But when we start to analyse what's involved in validity, it turns out that there are a number of particular features that are involved. And let me outline some of those briefly, and I'll go on to talk about each of these in turn. So the first one, particularly when we're talking about younger learners, is to have an assessment that's appropriate for their age group. This is particularly important with younger learners who are just starting in school, say 5 to 8 year olds. There are real constraints on the kinds of assessments that we can undertake with learners of that age. As they get older, then there is a wider range of opportunities for different kinds of assessment. Obviously, assessments have to be practical, so you can pick up a lot of ideas about assessments that might be nice to use, but they're not necessarily very practical in ways that I'll talk about in a few moments. Reliability is another key concept in assessment. Sometimes reliability and validity are considered to be the two most important aspects of assessment, but according to our current understanding of validity, reliability is a very important factor that contributes to validity, and sometimes, as I'll maybe indicate later on, there's something of a trade-off between making a test highly reliable, but at the same time having a good level of validity. The fourth feature that is important is that the assessment should give meaningful results. So in the classroom context, we want to give feedback to our students, which will be helpful for them. For summative assessment, we need to have scores or grades or other kinds of results that will be meaningful to parents or to school administrators or other people who have an interest in the performance of our students or the performance of the students in the whole organisation or the whole education system. And then finally, this is something which didn't tend to be emphasised so much in the past when we talked about language testing, but now is considered much more important, the idea that any kind of exam or test or assessment should promote good learning. So it should work, so teaching and assessment should work together. Whereas in the past, often examinations were seen as something quite separate. So language testing was seen as a very specialised and technical field, which involved experts in statistics and in in test design. But now we're trying to break down those barriers and to say that there should be quite a close interaction between the way that we assess our students and the way that we teach them and the way that we promote effective learning. All right, now let me go through each of those 5 features in turn, going back to the first one, age appropriate. I think in the last webinar, David Noonan said a little bit about this in his presentation about speaking and listening tasks, and he talked about stages of cognitive development following the model developed by the Swiss psychologist Piaget. As I said, a number of these concerns relate particularly to younger learners, say 8-year-olds and younger, but we have to recognise that younger children have a limited attention span and ability to concentrate, so typically assessments for them will be shorter. Also, younger learners, whether they be native speakers or second language learners, tend to pick up initially chunks of language rather than individual words or grammatical features. They learn whole phrases, good morning, how are you, thank you, those kinds of things. My name is such and such. And they may not actually be able to even know what the individual words are, or certainly the grammatical structure of those kinds of phrases. Also, they pick up language through songs and games and rhymes, those sorts of things. So that's what I mean by a holistic approach. So if learners are operating at that sort of holistic level of using language, then that needs to be reflected in the way that we assess them. Also, those younger learners are just developing their literacy skills in their first language, and so you'll certainly notice that tests for younger learners make a lot of use of pictures and of spoken language rather than writing tasks or spelling. So particularly if they, in their first language, have a different writing system from English, then that's an issue with younger learners. Also, if looking at assessing speaking skills, then we have to recognise that younger learners take time to learn how to interact with each other, with classmates in the classroom, learn how to conduct a conversation, to take their turn in a discussion rather than interrupting, and more generally to know how to conduct a worthwhile conversation. So there are those kinds of skills that learners are developing when they're young, which need to be considered in designing tests that are suitable for them. Also, their knowledge of the world is related to home, to family, to their local community. They have limited knowledge of the wider world. Of course, this is a more general issue even with older learners. We know that background knowledge of topics can play a role in listening and reading tasks. That's something we need to take into account in deciding what kinds of spoken and written texts are suitable for speaking assessment. So those are some kinds of things we consider in terms of age appropriateness. The second characteristic is having an assessment that's practical. That's one reason in traditional tests and exams that there's a heavy emphasis on reading and writing and on language knowledge, grammar and vocabulary, maybe translation skills, because those are the aspects of language that can easily be assessed in a large scale through a written examination. So in olden times, and maybe even nowadays, with fairly traditional national examinations, there's much more emphasis on reading and writing than there may be on listening and speaking. So there are a lot of practical difficulties with conducting speaking assessment on a large scale, as I'll talk about more later on. So yeah, listening and speaking involve particular challenges. If the school is in a noisy environment, it may not be possible to have a quiet environment to give students the opportunity to listen to spoken input. IT technology is opening up a lot of new opportunities for different kinds of assessments, which can be very practical and very efficient in a number of ways. But the question here is whether that kind of technology is available. If we're talking about a national examination, whether students in all parts of the country have access to this kind of technology, and also internet access can be an issue there. So internet-based tests obviously depend on good electricity supply and a stable access to the internet. On another level, if we're talking about the kind of alternative assessments that I discussed earlier, the size of the class and the number of students that the teacher has to deal with is a real issue. So with things like classroom observation, individual conferencing, obviously, but also portfolios and other kinds of alternative assessments, it's much more practical to implement these forms of assessment if class sizes are relatively small, say 15 or 20, as compared with 40 or 50, and even more so if the teacher is not just working on an intensive program with one group of students, but has to teach 3 or 4 or 5 different classes. The other issue with alternative assessment is that it requires assessment skills on the part of teachers. As I mentioned earlier, it's quite a common experience that not much attention is paid to this in teacher education programs in different countries around the world. And so this is becoming a real issue among those who advocate and promote these alternative forms of assessment in the classroom. It really depends on the teachers to be able to design and implement these kinds of assessments effectively. Now, reliability is quite a big topic. I could spend a whole webinar just talking about this. Reliability, I guess the other word that we use for this is consistency, getting consistent results. So in principle, we would hope that if students take the test today and then they take the test again next week, that we would get more or less the same results. Also, if the test is being given in different classes in the school, so classes at the same level, that it doesn't depend on which classroom they're in, the kind of result that they get, that the test is administered in the same way for the students in each of those classrooms. So that's part of what we mean by consistency. The other aspect of reliability is that we want all students to have an equal opportunity to perform to the best of their ability, to be able to show what they're capable of, what they've already achieved in terms of English ability. So the kind of factors that can influence our reliability can be divided into these 3 categories: things to do with the environment in which they take the assessment, things related to the students themselves, and also things, features of the test or the assessment procedures. So looking at each of these in turn, and I'm just kind of summarising points here. Obviously, the assessment environment needs to be familiar. Again, for younger learners, probably it's best for them to take an assessment within their own classroom or their own school. It's maybe only older learners who can comfortably be sent off to a test centre somewhere else. Also, maybe if we're talking about a speaking assessment, it needs to be conducted by the teacher or by a familiar adult rather than someone, an examiner that the children haven't met before. And yeah, the environment needs to be quiet and non-distracting so that students, as I said, have the best opportunity to demonstrate what they're capable of and what they already know. So looking at the students themselves, obviously they need to be in good health if they have an illness, or if they've had an emotional upset, some kind of turmoil within their family, that will affect the reliability of the assessment of those students. Anxiety is an interesting one. So for an important kind of assessment, maybe you do need to be a little bit anxious, just as actors often are very tense before they go on to the stage. And just in the same way as I've been a little bit nervous about getting ready for this webinar today. But, so there's a kind of positive anxiety which helps to motivate us to perform to the best of their ability. But on the other hand, there are some students who suffer from test anxiety, that it becomes a negative experience for them. So that's why we have to try to make the situation as comfortable for them as possible. And one way we can do that is by preparing them. So if it's an important test, they need to be given the opportunity to take some practice tests, to know what's involved in the assessment, how to mark their answers, what kind of response is considered appropriate, and so on. So there is a role for teachers that's appropriate to help their students to prepare for an important summative assessment so that they are motivated to perform well. If students are not taking the assessment seriously, if they know it doesn't really count for anything, that can reduce the reliability of the assessment. Now, characteristics of the test itself. For an important kind of test, or what we call a standardized test, normally the test will be written and then tried with a group of learners, and not the learners who will be taking the test for real, but for a group of other similar learners, just to see that the test is how much time it takes them, because it's not always easy to predict how long it'll take students to respond to a test, particularly if it involves more open-ended kinds of tasks. Also, we need to look at the difficulty level of the test. Ideally, it should be in the middle range of difficulty, not too easy, not too hard. So from a technical point of view, we look at tests from this point of view. Obviously, the teacher can use this more informally. Sorry, I skipped a slide there. So that if a test is not suitable, it's quite easy to change it and then maybe revise it for using it next time. Or if you have an assessment procedure, you can try it out initially and then maybe revise it or modify it in various ways if it turns out that the students find it too difficult to know what to do. So having clear instructions is important for students so that they understand what they're supposed to do. If it's a multiple choice test and they have to record their answers on an answer sheet, then they need to understand and maybe have some practice in doing that. The other important element in reliability is the method of scoring. So some exams are specifically designed to be highly reliable in that sense. They use multiple choice items, true, false items, or other kind of items where there's one right answer and one wrong answer, or only one right answer. And so in that case, the scoring can be fairly objective and we can achieve a high level of reliability or consistency in the scoring. But for other kinds of assessment, more subjective judgment is required, particularly for speaking or writing tasks, but also, say, for reading and writing, for reading and listening assessments, where the learners have to write an answer to answer questions rather than just choosing the correct answer in a true, false, or multiple choice type of item. So it's more difficult, in fact it's impossible to achieve the same level of reliability with subjective items, but this is one illustration of the point of the balance that we have to achieve between high reliability with consistent or objective scoring and high validity where there are certain kinds of skills that we want to assess, which can't be reduced to objective test items. So we have to live with a certain amount of a reduced level of reliability for those more open-ended kinds of tasks as compared with, say, objective tests of grammar and vocabulary and listening and reading ability. All right, now the other two characteristics, so producing meaningful results. So this has to be related to the purpose of the assessment. So for example, if we have a placement test, then the kind of results we're looking for is that we can interpret each student's score in terms of what level of our teaching program each student belongs to. And so that's the kind of meaningful result we're looking for. And also we find that not too many students have been misplaced on the basis of their placement test scores. But looking more generally at assessments, we need a point of reference normally. So if we're judging the validity of a classroom achievement test, then we relate it to the textbook. So, a progress test may be based on 1 or 2 units in the course textbook. And so the test should represent a good sample of the material or the learning objectives that the students have been working on recently. For a broader achievement exam, then maybe the school curriculum is the reference point. So to judge whether a test is valid or not, we need to see the extent to which it represents what they're supposed to have learned, what they're supposed to have mastered during the course of the school year or during their whole primary education in terms of the learning objectives of the curriculum. So it could be a school curriculum or the national curriculum. On an international scale, I guess more and more the Common European Framework of Reference is becoming more important, both for classifying teaching materials, but also reporting levels of achievement or proficiency in, say, an international test like the Cambridge exams or TOEFL. And I know within particular countries, also I know in East Asia, I'm not sure about the situation in Latin America, but this has become a very important reference point. There are arguments for and against using that, what was originally a European framework for adult learners with younger learners in school, but I don't have time to go into those sorts of issues. But the more general point is that to judge the validity of the test, depending on the kind of test it is, we need some kind of point of reference of this kind that I've listed here. And the last point, I guess, is implicit in what I've already been saying, that good assessments should contribute to student learning in these kinds of ways. So sometimes national exams tend to be fairly traditional in nature. They're run by an examinations authority that's quite separate from the Ministry of Education, if we're talking about national examinations. And examination authorities tend to be fairly conservative and to emphasise consistency and reliability over validity. So there's often a tension there with major tests and exams as to the extent they relate to the curriculum that the students were supposed to have been following. But then there are these other characteristics also, which obviously are more relevant to continuous or formative assessment, and those are things that I've already discussed. Okay, well, I'm just checking my watch. Looks like I'm making quite good time here. Just to sum up this issue of validity, so these 5 features that I've just been talking about collectively contribute to the overall validity or the overall quality of the assessment. So all 5 of them are important, but depending on the purpose of the assessment, some may have more weight than others in particular cases. All right, now let's move on. I think I need to have a little drink here. Let's move on to the last topic, assessing speaking ability. First of all, some of the challenges, which I guess you're all familiar with. So from a learner's perspective, obviously speaking, there's some debate about which is the most difficult skill to master, but I think you could make a good argument that speaking is quite challenging, especially if students don't have the opportunity to speak English outside of class or to be exposed to English in their environment, if it's essentially a foreign language for them. Another thing, obviously, thinking about anxiety about assessments is that with speaking, you've got to talk to somebody, right? Even if it's just the teacher or the examiner, but even more if you have to speak in front of the class. It's a public performance, and all of us, when we're starting to learn to speak a second language, make a lot of mistakes, and there's many opportunities to be embarrassed and uncomfortable about that. And then also there's the other feature of speaking, if it involves interaction, which I think I've already mentioned, that if you're in a conversation or discussion, it's one thing to be able to prepare what you want to say, but then if interaction is involved, you've also got to understand what the other person says back to you and respond to that appropriately. So that can also be a challenge in any kind of speaking environment, whether it be in the classroom or in using the language outside in the real world. From an assessment perspective, as I've already suggested, one of the practical difficulties with assessing speaking ability is that learners have to be assessed one by one, or at the most in small groups. So we can't put them, large numbers of students, into an exam room at the same time. I guess with computer technology now, computer-based tests can assess students on a fairly large scale, but traditionally we assess students individually. I've already mentioned this issue of consistency or reliability, particularly in high-stakes assessment situations, in summative assessment. And then more generally, we can design speaking tasks that are fairly constrained, ones that I mentioned earlier, like reading aloud a passage or answering questions. But if it's a more open-ended speaking task, potentially there are all of these aspects of speaking that an examiner or a rater needs to pay attention to. So for speaking tasks, examiners or raters have to be carefully trained to know what aspects of the student's performance to pay attention to, and to be able to monitor those while the student is talking, unless the speaking performance is recorded and then rated later on. Looking again analytically, I guess I've already touched on this, we can so traditionally speaking has been done as a monologue situation where just one person, one student at a time is talking. But more and more from a validity point of view, we're also interested in assessing their ability in dialogue and in group interaction. And so dialogue is where there are two speakers, and here I've illustrated two situations, one where the child is talking to the teacher, talking to an adult. Another kind of assessment, which is very interesting, not so easy to observe maybe, is where two students, two classmates or two friends are talking to each other. And then we have the group interaction situation where there are 3 or 4, maybe more students working together. So going over the kind of tasks that are appropriate here for each situation in turn, as I've suggested before, sometimes we're primarily interested in language elements, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and fluency. So the kind of tasks we can use for that are picture naming or picture description, reading aloud a written passage, or sentence repetition, a kind of oral dictation where the teacher reads out a sentence and the students have to repeat it It's a way of assessing grammatical ability in the language. And then for what I'm calling here solo or monologue talk, these are the kind of speech functions that we can assess on that basis. In introducing yourself, telling a story, giving directions, or giving a talk. And these are very much the kind of tasks, these kind of monologue tasks, if you're familiar with the TOEFL test for younger learners, TOEFL Junior and TOEFL Primary. I've outlined here from the website the kind of tasks. So for the older learners, there are 4 different tasks that they're given: read aloud, picture narration, telling a story based on a sequence of pictures, and then listen and speak activities where they hear a talk and then have to summarize it or respond to it, give their opinion about it. For the primary level, there are these kinds of functions that are involved. So there are various prompts, a spoken prompt or maybe a visual prompt that the learners are presented with, and they have to respond to those. So the important thing about the TOEFL tests is that they're computer-based tests. So they're delivered on a laptop or a tablet, I guess, and then the students' responses are recorded, and then they're sent back to the US, I guess, or to they're transmitted by the internet to examiners who then rate students' performance and return the results. So this kind of assessment has high reliability. So there are highly trained raters who are listening to each candidate's performance and rating them. And all of the candidates are presented with prompts in the same way. These are all pre-recorded on the computer program. But the question here is the issue of validity, because these are what we call one-way or monologue type speaking tasks, which is one of the limitations at the moment for speaking assessment on a computer. Looking at a dialogue situation where there are 2 speakers, so these are the type of talk that can form the basis for that kind of assessment. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And there are assessment tasks that are suitable for that purpose. Maybe you're familiar with these as teaching activities in the classroom, but the ways in which they can be adapted to be used for assessment purposes as well. And then for group interaction, similar sorts of tasks for dialogue, but the main point here is that there are 3 speakers involved, just 2, and maybe there are some kinds of tasks like debating an issue, conducting a meeting for older learners may be appropriate, problem solving. So some of these can be done just with pairs of learners, but we may also be interested to see how learners can tackle them in a larger group. So the kind of issues that arise when we go beyond just pairs of students, one of them is allocation of turns. So one problem with a group situation can be that one student or 2 students dominate the talk. And so we need to have ways of finding that each of the students in the group have opportunities to demonstrate their speaking ability. So maybe the teacher has a role in allocating turns. And so we need to think about how if we're using these kinds of activities for assessment purposes, think about how they can be designed so that there is consistency and fairness for each student to be able to contribute to the discussion. And also from the teacher's point of view, or for the examiner's one, where you have 3 or 4 people speaking, especially if they're speaking at the same time, interrupting each other sometimes, it can be difficult to separate out the individual contributions that students are making. So that's the kind of challenge that arises when we look to use these kinds of activities for assessment purposes. Looking at the classroom context, if you have seen the webinar, the last one in the series by David Noonan and Julie Choi, there were some specific activities of the kind that I've just been talking about, which involve peer work, group work, individual work, which could provide the basis for assessment in the classroom setting. So it requires the teacher to be monitoring the activities of the groups, giving feedback to students, and keeping records, maybe with a checklist or some other kind of recording instrument, so that the teacher can keep track of each student's performance. And I guess the thing about doing this kind of assessment in the classroom is that, unlike a formal test or exam, it's not a one-off event. So if you use these kinds of activities on a regular basis in the classroom, you can assess students progressively. So maybe for assessment purposes, you monitor one group this week and another group next week, and so on. So over the course of the term or a longer period of study, you have opportunities to observe how each student can perform these kinds of speaking tasks. And also there are opportunities for self-assessment and peer assessment. Let me give you a couple of examples of these. A simple instrument for younger learners to assess their own speaking performance in, say, a paired speaking task. So here we just have hopefully smiley faces, but also faces that are not really smiling if they're not so happy with the way that with how they enjoyed the task, or whether they did it well. So a number of simple statements that the learners respond to, and this is a worksheet that the teacher can collect and use as the basis for recording, as one basis for identifying students that are having problems, and maybe a basis for giving feedback to the students as well. Here's another example. The font here is fairly small. You may not be able to read this, but this is a feedback form from other students, a peer feedback form, where one student in the class is giving a talk explaining a particular process that has been studied in class. So in this case, the form has two components to it: some statements that the students respond to. I understood what the speaker was talking about. Yes, some, or no. The speaker described how everything worked. The speaker explained in steps I could follow, and so on. And then incomplete sentences. I liked it when the speaker did so-and-so. The speaker was good at this and that, explaining the process. Maybe the speaker could have spoken more loudly, or looked at us more. So notice that most of this form, the statements and are written in a positive way. So the idea is to emphasize peers, to give mostly positive feedback, while at the same time identifying things that may need to be improved. Let's see, I'm doing pretty well for time. So I'll just take a few more minutes before I finish to give you maybe a little bit of opportunity to ask a few questions. One kind of format which is not used in the young learners exams at Cambridge, the starters, movers and flyers, but in the higher level exams, which some of you may be familiar with, the preliminary and key exams for schools, and certainly in the exams for adult learners, where the speaking assessment is set up this way. There are two candidates and two examiners. One of the examiners is called the interlocutor. That's the one who actually talks to the two students taking the assessment. The other one concentrates on assessing the students, on giving them grades for the different aspects of their performance. So this format is in 4 parts. It starts off with an individual interview by one of the examiners with each of the candidates separately. Part 2 is a discussion of a photo. Each candidate has their own photo, and then they have the opportunity to ask 1 or 2 questions about the other candidate's photo. Part 3 involves a dialogue situation where the two candidates have to work together to discuss alternatives related to a particular issue and to try to reach an agreement. It's a kind of problem-solving task. And then part 4 moves to a kind of group discussion, but one obviously that's controlled by the interlocutor, where they have a more general discussion about these kinds of things that are listed on the screen. So this assessment is designed to achieve a maximum balance between validity, so involving different kinds of speaking activity, the monologue in parts 1 and 2, a little bit of dialogue in part 2, certainly dialogue in part 3, and then group interaction in part 4. And also the distinction between the two examiners, the one who focuses mostly on conducting the exam and interacting with the students, the other, the assessor, who focuses purely on making judgments about each student's performance. All right, so just to sum up my overall webinar, there are 4 points here which relate to each of the 4 topics that I've covered. The distinction between language tests and language assessment, the issue of the purposes of assessment at those different stages, initial, continuing and summative assessment, and then the characteristics of a good assessment in terms of validity and those 5 features that I mentioned. And then specifically in relation to speaking assessment, I emphasize the point that considering validity, it's important to try to represent not only monologue type talk, but also dialogue and group interaction as well. All right, so that's the end of my formal presentation. So I'll get out of there now and hand it over to Gary.
Okay, thank you, John. Professor Reed, thank you for all the information that you've given us today. We do have some questions that some attendees have put into our Q&A box. So let me ask you some of these. The first one from Victor, formative assessment or summative assessment? What is better to use with our students because of the COVID-19 virus?
Yeah, well, again, it comes back to the purpose of the assessment. There are certainly challenges for summative assessment because, particularly for, let's say, national or international exams, because normally students have to go to a test centre or to an examination hall in order to take that kind of test. So that's been a big challenge for organisations that conduct those kinds of tests in order to see whether it's possible to conduct such assessments on an online basis. There are obviously issues of test security and making sure that students are not cheating or receiving help that's not appropriate in carrying out the tasks. In the COVID situation, for summative assessment, I guess it really depends on how your teaching is set up. So if you're able to do online teaching, well, I guess one good thing is if you're working with students one-on-one, it opens up opportunities for conferencing. And I suppose realistically, if you're using Zoom or some other kind of platform like this, you tend to be restricted in the number of students that you can deal with. So in some ways, it opens up new opportunities, particularly if you have video assessment, where you're able to have this kind of face-to-face interaction with individual students.
Yeah, so we just I saw a comment in the chat. Some of the attendees would like to see your face. So
okay.
It's possible to
sorry, have I turned it off?
Oh, yeah,
okay,
no
there I am.
Oh, there he is. So there's the...
Yeah, that's what I look like. I'm sitting here in my office at the University of Auckland.
Yeah, let me pull out another few questions. We're getting some more in here. Here from Lubna Misumi. How can we ensure transparency in online assessments?
Transparency, maybe that means making sure that the responses that the students do represent their own work and there's not someone coaching them in the
Yeah.
background. That is certainly a challenge, and I've been in a number of online forums where people have talked about this kind of issue. There's quite sophisticated technology, which I guess a lot of schools don't have access to, where you can monitor, you can have a camera which can look all around the room to make sure that there's no one else in the room helping the students in some way. There are ways of monitoring the computer program itself. There are also strategies if students are taking the test on the computer for disabling some of the functions of the computer so that only the ones that are required for the test can be used. So a number of these developments were already in process before COVID, but a number of them have expanded very quickly just because of the new world that we're living in at the moment.
Okay, and we'll do one last one here from Claudia. What would be his recommendation to deal with the different abilities of our students when assessing? So I guess multi-level classrooms, I guess, how to assess.
Yeah. I suppose if you're using informal kinds of assessment, which don't involve writing a test or an exam paper or setting a formal task, you can take that into account through your observation of how different students perform. I know one issue that can arise even with paired assessments is how well the two students are matched. And so the discussions about whether they should already be friends, whether they should choose who to work with, and their arguments in favour of that, as distinct from working with someone that they haven't worked with before. It's maybe also important to match students who are at similar levels of ability. So that can be a problem for a good student who needs the cooperation of the other student to perform effectively, to demonstrate their interactive skills. But if the other student is very quiet and struggles to say anything, that also can have a negative effect on the performance of the good student. So there are certainly issues there. And so if we're thinking about speaking assessment particularly, one thing that the teacher can bear in mind that if you need to do a more formal assessment of student speaking ability, it may be fairer for them to think about which students you put together in a particular group or a particular pair on the basis of reliability, of making sure that each person has the opportunity to perform to the best of their ability.
Okay, thank you very much for answering these questions. So before everyone starts trickling out, once again, I'd like to thank Professor Reed for all the time and effort putting into his presentation today. And just before everyone leaves, I did see some questions in the chat regarding some of our previous presentations and some other materials. If you can find all of our previous webinars from the expert series or all the other kinds of webinars that we've done on our YouTube channel. So here is the name of our YouTube channel. We are also posting the link in the chat. So a lot of our webinars were referenced today. So if you want to go back and look at those webinar presentations, you can find them all on our YouTube channel. And for all of the, so we have one more actually webinar coming up for this month, next week, with our colleague Sue, who is also in the chat if you didn't see. So she'll be covering reading and eFutures eLibrary. So kind of talking about more extensive reading using readers. And for those that are attending, we do have a survey that we would like for you guys to fill out. Give us any suggestions that you would like for future webinars, and just give us overall feedback on anything that we can improve on moving forward, and any comments or questions that you'd like us to ask our presenters and experts, okay? And the last kind of little important thing for a lot of you, just to get in here, certificates. So we do give certificates for attendees. This is the information and contacts for all of the partners that we have in all the countries. We do ask to give them a little bit of time to get these certificates to you. Once you inquire to them, it'll take maybe a day or two. If after, say, 5 days or a week that you haven't received your certificate yet, then you can contact us directly through this email on the bottom, and we will be able to kind of figure out and get you guys your certificates. We've had some cases where, you know, an email was sent by either our partner or an attendee, and they just got lost somewhere on the internet. So this is the information to contact. And we had recently we had some daylight savings happen. So we have adjusted the times on our schedule. Just to go back, I saw someone ask in the chat. So we have adjusted our start times on our webinar schedule for daylight savings. I believe the only country right now that is listed here that was affected is Mexico. So for those that are in Mexico, the start times are going to be changing to 8 p.m. Okay? So, yep. One last thing before I let you guys go. We will be attaching all of the materials. The presentation that Professor Reed has prepared will be included in the follow-up email that will be sent out to all of the attendees today. So be sure to check your email that you'll be getting from Zoom, just following up, and you'll be able to get the presentation and all this contact information here. Akintayo, so all you need to do to get your certificate is look at, find your country on the table and send an email to the partner in your country. If your country isn't listed here, just send an email directly to us and we'll get that to you. All right? So I'd like to thank you guys again for taking your time out to join our webinar today. And one more time, thank you, Professor Reed, for giving us some time and presenting for all of our attendees today.
I'm very happy to do it. Thanks, everyone.
All right, so we'll see you all next week at the webinar. If I can have my colleague Yeti post the survey link one more time. It looks like some people just missed it. So we will post that just now before closing. So there we go. So make sure to fill out the survey, give us any feedback that you guys have, and we will see you next week. All right, bye.